headquarters of Telesur English in Quito, Ecuador. This is From the South, and I'm Camila Escalante. President Nicolas Maduro has now closed the 18th Latin American and Caribbean Student Congress in the Venezuelan capital with an address to the participating international delegations. President Maduro repeated his call to the Venezuelan people to prepare for the defense of the country's institutions and initiatives as they face attacks by the U.S. empire. This following new U.S. sanctions against Venezuela's local committees for supply and production food distribution program.
We're in Caracas, living a process of resistance, alive and active, of the Bolivarian Revolution. I am sure of it, because I can see it in your eyes. There will no longer be selling out or defeat. What is to come from here forward will be advances, victories of popular movements, victories from student movements, grand transformations of the Latin American Revolution.
Venezuelan representatives will continue dialogue next week in Oslo, Norway. In an official press release, the Norwegian government has stated that the representatives of the main political actors in Venezuela have decided to return to Oslo next week to continue a process facilitated by Norway. It goes on to say, "We reiterate our commitment to continue supporting the search for an agreed-upon solution between the parties in Venezuela." Norway commends the parties for their efforts and appreciates their disposition, states the Norwegian Minister for Foreign Affairs. Cuba's University Federation has once again been elected to lead the direction of the Latin American and Caribbean Continental Organization of Students, the OCLAI. This decision was taken during the celebration of the 8th Latin American and Caribbean Congress of Students, which is taking place in Venezuela, where different organizations reorganize the work of this student federation. The closing of this Congress will include an anti-imperialist student march and activities to be held at the Polidero de Caracas. Citizens in El Salvador are demonstrating in a march headed for the Embassy of Venezuela in support of the sovereignty and self-determination of the Venezuelan people. Our correspondent Ernesto Avalos has it for us.
We're following the march, which is running through the streets of the Salvadoran capital, which is headed for the headquarters of the Venezuelan embassy in El Salvador. The march is made up of the Salvadoran Solidarity Network with Venezuela, members of the social movement, and lawmakers and members of the FMLN as well, all participating in this solidarity march. One of the slogans here today is respect for sovereignty and self-determination of the people. In addition, people have signed a statement saying that they're prepared to defend the Embassy of Venezuela against any attempts of intervention, such as that which occurred recently in the United States, where guests of the government of Venezuela were evicted from the embassy in Washington. This is all we have for the time being. Back to you in the studio.
And in Berlin, Germany, activists also demonstrated, this time outside of the U.S. Embassy, that the Trump administration lift sanctions blockade against Venezuela.
Between 2015 and 2018, the total losses and costs for the Venezuelan economy, which came as a result of the economic blockade imposed by the United States, are estimated to be $130 billion. Unilateral coercive measures, or what are called sanctions, amount to a systematic strategy and a massive human rights violation to the Venezuelan people, and have been classified by the UN as crimes against humanity. So here we block Venezuela to sanctions. Long live international solidarity with the people of Venezuela.
A new group of Venezuelans in Brazil are headed back home under the Return to the Homeland plan. People are on board that left Boa Vista and Manaus in northern Brazil, destined for the Santa Helena terminal in the state of Bolivar in Venezuela. Food and water has been provided for passengers on board both routes, who will receive medical attention upon their arrival. This initiative was established by President Nicolas Maduro and has benefited 14,000 Venezuelans since 2018. The remains of a 2.5-year-old child who died under the custody of U.S. Border Patrol have arrived in Venezuela. The body of Wilmer Ramirez arrived at the Guatemala City airport in a white coffin and will be taken to his native village today. The coffin was received by local immigration and foreign ministry officials. The minor was detained with his 23-year-old mother days after they crossed the U.S. southern border. Some days later, the child died in a U.S. hospital, apparently of pneumonia. This is the 5th minor to die in the custody of U.S. border authorities since December 2018. We'll take a short break now. Join us again in a minute. Welcome back. Cyril Ramaphosa has been sworn in as President of South Africa at an inauguration ceremony in the country's capital, Pretoria. Ramaphosa was elected president on May the 8th. On his inauguration, the president says he believes that South Africans are hoping for a better tomorrow and promised to fulfill that hope.
Many South Africans succumb to diseases that can't be treated. Many live lives of intolerable deprivation. Too many of our people do not work, especially the youth. In recent times, our people have watched as some of those in whom they had invested their trust have surrendered to the temptation of power and riches. I am humbled by the trust that you have bestowed upon me, and I'm also aware of the challenges our country faces, but I'm also alive to the fact that our people are filled with hope for a better tomorrow.
Our correspondent in South Africa reports.
South African President Cyril Ramaphosa is now one step closer to announcing his cabinet after being inaugurated now as the 6th President of South Africa by Chief Justice Mogoeng on Saturday afternoon. This is an event that was attended by thousands of people at the Pretoria's Loftus Versfeld. This is a first for South Africa since the dawn of democracy that we see an inauguration taking place at a stadium and not at the seat of government, which is the Union buildings. And that's what we saw when Nelson Mandela was installed as president back in 1994, and again Thabo Mbeki in 1999, and then 2014, and now fast forward to 2019, we see Cyril Ramaphosa already introducing some changes, and this was said to be a contingency plan or some sort of a plan to reduce the amount spent on inaugurations rather, and that's why it was held there, so that more people can also take part. And we saw former presidents, Kgalema Motlanthe, Thabo Mbeki, and the apartheid president, F.W. de Klerk, at the inauguration today, with an exception of former President Jacob Zuma, who did not make it to the inauguration. And we know that former President Jacob Zuma is facing corruption charges and was just in court on Friday. You may know that there are factions in the ANC party, the African National Congress, and Jacob Zuma was ousted, and we saw Cyril Ramaphosa coming in. And so now a lot of people see the ANC as a divided party with a faction that supports former President Jacob Zuma and another faction that supports now President Cyril Ramaphosa. And Cyril Ramaphosa has promised to create a smaller and leaner cabinet on Sunday when he announces it, and he said there'll be fewer people in his cabinet than there were before in previous administrations, and this is also a cost-cutting measure that he says he's taking, and to make his government more effective. And with the deputy president of the party usually becomes deputy president of the country. Now David Mabuza, when MPs were being sworn in, he's not sworn in with the rest of facing some internal party politics, so to say, that he needs to if President David Mabuza's problems to be sorted out, or he will, political analysts say, will cause even more divisions in the party, because there are people who support. A lot of people say Cyril Ramaphosa's presidency is credit to David Mabuza because it comes from support the African National Congress. But all of that will be clear on Sunday when he announces his cabinet. And we saw today's inauguration being attended by different leaders from the SADC region, from the East Africa region, from north parts of everywhere from the continent. Leaders of the continent were here to show that South Africa is still a country that has good relations with many countries here on the African continent. But tomorrow will set the real tone of what the next 5 years will look like for President Cyril Ramaphosa as he announces his cabinet. It's back to you, studio.
On March 14th, Mozambique was devastated by Cyclone Idai, which left more than 600 people dead and thousands displaced. To provide aid after the tragedy, Cuba sent a group of doctors. Our correspondent Andre Vieira traveled with doctors to see their humanitarian work firsthand.
Beira, capital of the province of Sofala, was the area hardest hit by Cyclone Idai. Throughout the central region of Mozambique, over 600 people lost their lives. The country was affected by winds of more than 200 kilometers an hour. In response, a brigade of 40.
I'm not well and came here to see a doctor. My whole body hurts, my head and my back.
Over 20,000 people have been treated by the doctors of the Henry Reeve Brigade. Ill and with her defenses low, she's one of nearly 300 people who have undergone surgery here.
I am feeling well. I was not eating. I could only take water and soup. I no longer have those problems. Today I was operated and I feel very well now.
Beyond helping victims of the cyclone, the Cuban doctors are in people who have been suffering ailments before the disaster hit.
I had been waiting for 2 years to have surgery in the central hospital. That's why I came here, to get the surgery I need.
And so Antonio Francisco is off to have his operation, something made possible only thanks to the efforts of the Cuban people who have financed all the work.
To the best, we have cured many patients who did not have access to medical care, and much less to surgery.
The phrase our commander-in-chief says. And it's that by providing aid internationally,
Since it was set up in 2005, the Medical Brigade has sent over 8 world. Here from revolutionary Cuba. These are people who are ready to help others around the world.
Has ordered the suspension of the election results announced. Ballots from one counted. Opposition issued complaints rigging on Friday. the main opposition party's leader, Lazarus Chakwera, after noticing the party claims are irregularities in results from 10 of the country's 28 results released found incumbent leading, while his close Chakwera of the vote.
Court seeking their intervention because, the court is independent in this matter. They listened to us and they agreed with us, and therefore they have ordered the Malawi Electoral Commission to do a recount.
Results.
Africans around the world are celebrating Africa Day. Every year on May 25th, African countries mark the establishment of the organization in 1963, now known as the African Union. Several countries at a time when they sought to gain independence.
So I'm plain speaking. And for the sake of Africa, let us speak plainly. As I see it, our greatest danger stems from disunity and the inability to see that the realization of our hopes and aspirations, the realization of our objective of total African independence, and of our future progress and prosperity is inextricably bound up with the necessity to unify our policy and actions in connection with the continued struggle for independence and the greater task of economic and social reconstruction beyond it. We must therefore face the issue of African unity now, for only unity will make the artificial boundaries and regional demarcations imposed by colonialism obsolete and superfluous. African unity will thus provide an effective remedy for border disputes and internecine troubles.
Iran's foreign minister has called on neighboring countries and the international community to stand up against U.S. sanctions in a bid to serve their national interests and preserve global security. Speaking to reporters upon his arrival in the Pakistani capital of Islamabad, Minister Mohammad Javad Zarif pointed to U.S. sanctions against independent nations around the world and said it is clear that these sanctions are in fact targeting the international order, and if they are not countered, they will trouble the international community. He went on to say that we are witnessing the simultaneous imposition of sanctions against Iran and China. A number of young Palestinians were shot and others suffocated during their participation in the Great Return March along eastern Gaza Strip. The Palestinian Health Ministry confirmed that a paramedic was among the injured by tear gas canisters fired by Israeli forces at the east of Khan Yunis. The ministry added that a number of citizens were wounded by rubber-coated bullets and dozens of suffocation cases were confirmed. We'll take a short break now. Join us again after this. The presidency of Salvador Sanchez Cerén is coming to a close in El Salvador. Earlier, I spoke to Roberto Zapata, who is the General Secretary of Amate El Salvador, a civil society organization which works for the economic, social, and cultural rights of the LGBTI community in the country. Amate is a founding organization of the LGBTI Salvadoran Federation and the Central American Network for the LGBTI Labor Justice. I began by asking about the community and its presence in the Central American migrant caravans, which began last year.
No, unfortunately, one of the debts that the government has with the LGBTI community is the statistical part. So we don't have any official statistics on what the LGBTI community is facing. In this specific regard about the migration, we just know that dozens of LGBTI members, especially trans women, have left the country in the last, well, over the last 2 decades, but even more increased. It has increased a lot in the last 2 years. What we know is that certain of these LGBTI members come to the LGBTI organizations to seek help, to seek advice. And still, even though we try to say that there are many risks for them to go to other countries in a irregular kind of way, they still want to leave the country because they are just facing this persecution that you talked about from gangs, from police members, and from other economic, poverty and other issues.
What are some of those struggles and movements that the different sectors in El Salvador continue to face, and what are some of the outstanding critiques that they hold for the outgoing government?
Well, for the LGBTI movement, I would say that one of the biggest critiques is that we did find certain allies, like I was saying, but at the same time, there were other really strategic ministries that we did not find the same accountability. For example, the Ministry of Education has a big debt with a comprehensive sex education program, and that certainly was one of the parts that still was left out of all other policies of the government. That's pretty, in terms of the LGBTI right, I would say that's a priority now, but in terms of other rights, I would say that the government probably could do more for economic rights of the whole population. So there are certain social policies that helped reduce poverty, but at the same time, people still doesn't feel that they have enough to have a better living in this country. So that's why multiple, probably thousands of people keep migrating to other countries.
Absolutely. And we hope that we'll be able to speak with some of the other advocates and organizers that you work with there, because for some time, a focal point for the international community has been the issue of free, safe, and legal abortion. So tell us where laws are in El Salvador in terms of the fight for abortion now.
Well, we currently have a complete prohibition of abortion in El Salvador, and women can face up to 40 years in jail for this reason. And I think it has been over 2 years now that a project of law in the Legislative Assembly has been discussed, but it has not yet found the necessary votes in order to pass. And even though the government supported, I would say it was not the same for all the sectors of the government. And as it's kind of the same with the LGBTI topics. So the government, but
what are your expectations for incoming President Nayib Bukele?
Well, right now we are trying to figure out what to expect, because the experience we have in the LGBTI movement is the one that goes back to 2015 when he was a candidate for the major. He met up with us and he said that he wanted to be in the right side of history, and that he did not agree with discrimination against us. And he had many promises with the LGBTI organization. But in 3 years, the promises he made back then, what will happen in this new administration. But based on this previous experience, we are that things his campaign as presidential candidate, he mentioned that a marriage is only between men. He doesn't believe in this. Don't know what will happen, but a social movement, we are just preparing ourselves to face anything, because we will not let the new administration take us what we have advanced and the achievements we have made. Absolutely.
Thank you so much, Roberto. We've been speaking to Roberto Zapata. He is the Secretary General of AMETE El Salvador and joins us today from San Salvador. Thanks again.
Thank you very much for.
And finally, Ecuadorian cyclist Richard Carapaz won stage 14 of the Giro Italia to take the lead in the overall standings. He now becomes the first Ecuadorian to be leader of the 3 great cycling rounds, leading in Italy, France, and Spain, and doing so just a year after becoming the first cyclist from his country to win a stage in one of the 3 big events. We've come to the end of this news brief. You can find these and many other stories on our website at tellusarenglish.net. And join us on social media, Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram. For Tell Us Our English, I'm Camila Escalante. Thanks for watching.